All right, our final model, the McClelland and Rumelhart model. Again, this is old. McClelland was 1950s, something like that, explaining how we recognize things. So here we have a model, sort of a neural network, I guess we could argue. Um, So information is going to flow from the bottom up. We've already been looking at neural networks that illustrated that with our feature detectors in the last video. So you're probably already, primed to be thinking about, okay, you start at the bottom with those feature detectors, you work your way up to the next level, and then you work your way up to the next level, right? And the thing to note in this model that's a little bit different is that there is interaction between the nodes at the same level. So see how the arrows are going between multiple nodes from the bottom level to the top level. They're kind of interacting between that way. And then you also see that there's a straight line between the A and the N, for example, and the N and the T. So you can have this the A and the T, and right? You can have communication within the nodes at the same level. So it's a little bit more complicated than the previous examples I've been showing you. Another factor that's important is that your higher level word detectors can influence the lower level detectors. So see those arrows that are going downward? From you see the word take has an arrow going down to the T, right? Like they're going back and forth. So it's not strictly moving upward like you had seen in the previous models that I've been showing you. The connections include both what we call excitatory and inhibitory. So if it's depicted in a black line, that's what we would call an excitatory connection that they're trying to illustrate here. So that means that, going from the A up to the word trap, it's the node at the level A is exciting the neurons that are involved in the full word trap. You see those red arrows, those are indicating inhibitory connections, where for some reason, and I don't know exactly all the details on this particular diagram, but the A is red going up to the word able. The word able is red coming back to the word A, or the letter A. So they're sort of reciprocally inhibiting each other for some reason. So you can have one level telling the next level, hey, pass this on, this is important, react to this, maybe produce an outcome, an output of some sort, maybe you're going to say something or do something. And then in the red cases, it's like, don't share this, don't pass this along. If you look from the bottom level where it's just the straight lines, and then you follow the red arrows going to other things, the red arrows seem to be mostly going to places where that particular feature is unrelated to that particular letter, but maybe that's not a perfect model. I'm not, because the horizontal line that's on the far left doesn't seem to have an inhibitory relationship to N, and it's the one that doesn't have a horizontal line. So maybe that's not inhibitory. The premise and the complexity of these connectionistic models is how information can flow upwards, side to side, downwards, and exciting and inhibiting those nodes that are involved or not involved in this particular word or idea or whatever we're perceiving. So let's take, we've been talking about kind of two-dimensional things or words. Let's try and transition this to three-dimensional objects. Like, how do you recognize those glasses that I showed you earlier? Again, hierarchy of detectors. You're going to have these, feature detectors at the bottom, and they're going to flow towards things that are specifically going to pertain to three-dimensional objects. They're called geons. I've heard some people pronounce them geons. I don't know. I've only ever read it. I've heard people pronounce it. I've never heard the theorists say it out loud. So geons, I don't know. So these feature detectors flow upwards to these larger features, right? So we've got sort of a cylinder, we've got a cubic kind of rectangle, we've got a three-dimensional cone, right? Like these different elements are called geons or geons. You can identify a geon from virtually any angle. So it doesn't matter if you're looking straight on with the rectangle or you're looking at it from a corner like we are here, your brain recognizes that element as the same thing, It doesn't have to be a straight-on view. Most objects can be recognized from just a few geons. Like you don't have to see all the different component geons that make up a form in order for you to start to recognize the form. Partial occlusion of objects does not necessarily prevent recognition, and that's important because in the real world, things that are closer to us might be obscuring our view of something that's farther away. And if you literally could not recognize that object unless you could see every single bit of it, it would really inhibit your ability to see, to correctly recognize what was in your environment. You'd be like, well, I think it's a car, but I mean, I can't see the third wheel on it, so I'm going to have to say, I don't know what that is. Can you imagine? Here's an example of how your brain reacts to an object, a three-dimensional object called a hand. In that top picture, we're seeing it the palm side, and you see really strong, see that nice spike of activity there where the arrow is pointing, and very quick recognizing that that's a hand. Now in row 2, we're seeing the hand from the back, and again, really good, strong responding, a little less than when you're seeing a palm, but good responding. Now we have just a line drawing of an upright hand, and you're responding a little less, specifically and condensed and powerfully. Now we have in level 4, the hand is held in a different position, and again, you're responding well, but a little bit less than you had before. And then we have a even different line drawing down a little bit lower, where it's got less on level 5, where you've got a little less detail, smaller. And so we see a smaller response, and then we have just a mitten on level 6, and we see this weakest response. It's still related to a hand, so the same part of your brain that recognizes hands is still reacting to a mitten. It's just not as powerful, not as quick, not as long of a response, stuff like that. So we can see in the actual brain how our brain handles basically geons of a hand, right, and recognizes the component parts. And even as it's presented from a different angle, how our brain responds. So viewpoint-dependent cells, it might be the case that they kind of send a message to the cells that are viewpoint independent, and that maybe they share information. That's one of the important parts of this McClellan-Rumelhart theory, is that idea that you can sort of share information across the same level. So maybe I'm not seeing it exactly the way I need to see it to recognize it, but if I tell my neighboring cell, I think this might be a hand, that neighboring cell that maybe is independent, it doesn't care what orientation the hand's in, it's looking at maybe some aspect that is independent of orientation. It goes, yeah, you know what, I think you're right. I'm going to use your information as part of my input, right? So that gives us a much more robust perceptual system. All right, so our feature detectors float up to the geons, which then flow up to the geon assemblies, which is where we're going to start to put together the parts that seem to be making up that object. So what I did in this picture is I moved the geons next to what's ultimately going to be the object, right? So now I have the rectangle next to the curve, and I've got the cylinder next to the, I'll call it lampshade. And then ultimately we have objects, right? So here we have the lamp. It turns out to be a lampshade on a lamp post. Okay, so we recognize that from those geon assemblies that we had seen. We've got a suitcase that is the combination of the rectangle and the curve. We've got other kinds of objects that we could recognize. And so these geon assemblies are like combinations of a couple geons. It's not the whole object. It's, oh, I see that these two parts are present. Those are oftentimes present in see me getting primed to think about a lamp, or see me getting primed to think about a suitcase. And maybe I'm thinking about a number of things that contain a rectangle and a curve. Like it could be a suitcase, it could be a climbing structure at a park, it could be a bale of hay, it could be a bunch of things, right? So, but I'm primed and I'm ready for the kinds of things that tend to have rectangles and a curve on them. And that way, when I perceive the whole object, I'm pulling it all together with context and all the other factors that are present, and now I can accurately detect the object that I've been confronted with. So that's the idea of how something so complex as three-dimensional objects that may be made up of multiple geons. I mean, I gave you very simple ones here from our textbook, but some of our three-dimensional objects out in the world have lots of components to them, right? And so the idea that you might have these geons that then can be combined into geon assemblies can kind of prime you to start thinking in the right train of thought so that you can correctly recognize objects. All right, well, that concludes how we recognize objects. I will be seeing you in the next chapter next time we talk.